Hey, hello everybody. Welcome to the Reigning Threes podcast. I'm here with my close friend Max. We're going to be talking about the 80s. Let's get right into it.
All right. So, as our viewers may know, last time we talked about the 1970s and basketball. So it seems only natural that now we talk about the 80s. And big takeaway from this decade is it really implemented a lot of things that we see in today's NBA. And it was kind of the starting point of a lot of things we see. Like All-Star Weekend first took off in the 80s. Big television deals took off in the 80s, big promotions, and also the implication of a salary cap is first in 80s creation. So just a lot of the reforms in the NBA that have lasted into the present kind of had their roots in the 80s. And I think that's big because it kind of shaped the league for years to come, and it kind of has a big impact on how the game is played today and what the shape of the league is like during the 80s, the entertainment especially was a major priority, and it really took off. Like, I don't know how you came across it, but I find that a lot of the television and the promotion for the league, it really started to happen in the 80s, and it just kind of became a national sport. Would you agree with that, Hoxa?
Yeah, definitely.
I think that a big part of it had to do with just the style of basketball because in the 90s and the 70s and the early 2000s, the game was really slow. There's a lot of low post play, limited ball movement. But in the 80s, the game was played pretty fast. There was a lot of offensive teams that emphasized ball movements and cuts and occasional three-point shooting. And the defense, it wasn't terrible by any means, but at the same time, there weren't too many truly elite defenders. So I think that emphasis on offense really helped to promote the game, and it really helped the league take off on a popularity standpoint. Some other notes I have, this was the first era where the star players of the league became profitable. As we discussed in previous decades, it's hard to market a guy like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as your best player because of his game, post hooks, post moves. It's not the most entertaining to watch. But now in the 80s, you have guys like Magic Johnson and Larry Bird and Michael Jordan, who we'll all talk about in a bit. But they really kind of transformed how entertaining the individual players in the NBA could be. Whereas before they were kind of boring and you watch basketball just for a team standpoint. In the 80s, I think people just started to watch for the players and the individual talents on display. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
A few other notes I have are, again, NBA finally became a staple off the court with things like shoe deals, celebrities attending games, and also the new national television deal implemented with CBS in the late 80s. And also the other big thing is the 80s is when the dunk contest and the three-point contest really took off. And I think that those are two events that they really define basketball, and they also are a big reason, like a big draw for fans. Do you have anything else you want to add on the 80s while we're
Oh,
here?
yeah, for sure. So obviously, in the 1979 1980 season, that's when the three-point line was added. And during the 80s, like the three-point line started to get more and more popular near the end, but it was still kind of a relatively not useless shot, but a shot that teams wouldn't necessarily take.
Yeah,
And at the time, it was also a pretty inefficient shot. So at the start of the decade, teams would shoot around 2 threes per game, and then by the end of the decade, it tripled to six. And the average three-point percentage at the time was about 28% from the three. And also, the 80s was kind of the era where it started to change from being a more center-dominated league where you needed a dominant center. It kind of
yeah,
transitioned to more of a guard slash wing hybrid like type. Uh, like teams would center their teams around those types of players like Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, Dr. J,
yeah,
at around the start of the 80s, and then eventually later Michael Jordan.
yeah,
Um, and like you said, there's a lot of high scoring games. The highest scoring game was actually in the 80s, which I'll talk about later. And it was between the Denver Nuggets and Detroit Pistons. But overall, like the style of play started to become more um, perimeter oriented, even
yeah,
though it wasn't necessarily like 3-point line range.
yeah,
Mid ranges became more popular. and centers. There's only really two great centers in the 80s, and
Yeah,
then
I was
this was kind
when
of
I was researching, I was really surprised to see just how talented the wings were, because it wasn't really like superstar players, but at the same time there were a lot of quality scorers and a lot of quality players at the small forward position, especially when compared to that of say the center position.
yeah. And also the 80s was kind of the era where there was a new wave of centers just coming in, like Patrick Ewing, Hakeem Olajuwon, where they kind of took parts from Kareem and Wilt's game and later like made it their own and made it more skilled. And Shaq also, no, Shaq came in the 90s. But yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, so while we've gotten the actual kind of idea of the era out of the way, we've both assembled our own all-decade teams, and I think we both have the same all-decade first team. I'll read it out. So for both of us, and feel free to say anything if I'm wrong. We have Magic Johnson of the LA Lakers, Isaiah Thomas of the Detroit Pistons, Larry Bird of the Boston Celtics, Moses Malone of the Philadelphia 76ers, Houston Rockets, and later a bunch of other teams as he grew older. And lastly, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar of the Lakers. Anything else to change or add?
So I actually have a difference. Although Moses Malone, who's a great player in the 80s, just to change things up, I added Michael Jordan there, just
Yeah,
because even though he did come around like mid to late 80s, in 1985, when he was in the league, he came guns blazing. He averaged 28 points his rookie year.
yeah,
He won MVP, Defensive Player of the Year during that decade, and he was also a three-time scoring champ.
yeah.
I
I
think
think
he
I
deserves it.
think that's definitely a fair choice, and I have no issues with it. My only thing is though, Moses, he won an MVP in the decade, he won a title, and he made it to a separate finals. So I think that just gives him the nod. But both are great choices, and both could definitely apply because, as I'm sure we're going to talk about later, Jordan had a defensive player in the decade, he had an MVP in the decade, and he had one of the craziest scoring years of all time. So that can definitely give him the nod over Moses. Anyways, for our second team, would you like to start us off with yours?
Yeah, so there's a couple of notable players left off, but I think this is a pretty solid team. So I have Alex English, James Worthy, Moses Malone, Dominique Wilkins, and Kevin McHale on my second team.
Yeah. All right. And then for me, I have Michael Jordan, Dr. J, James Worthy, Dominique Wilkins, and Kevin McHale. All these players are pretty much the stars of the era. They each brought a heck of a lot of scoring, at least. With Jordan, as we said, he was a superstar later in the decade. Dr. J, towards the start of the decade, had a title with the Sixers, an MVP award, and consistent scoring. And then with McHale, he was one of the better post scorers of the decade, won 3 rings with the Boston Celtics. And then Dominique Wilkins and James Worthy both were really good wing players who could score like crazy. Different levels of success throughout their careers, but nonetheless, both tremendously talented players.
Yeah, I think the difference between Milos and yours was I replaced Dr. J with Alex English.
Yeah,
Um, and the reason why I did that was because Alex English, he was the leading scorer in the 80s. Like he had the most points
yeah,
amongst everybody during that decade. So I thought um, I would give him a nod because Dr. J, although he was great in the 80s, that's kind of when his career started to tail off.
yeah,
Um, Around 1986 and 1987. So I thought I'd just replace him with Alex English.
yeah. And then for my third team, I have Alex English, most notably for the Denver Nuggets, George Gervin for the San Antonio Spurs and Chicago Bulls, Charles Barkley for the 76ers, Hakeem Olajuwon for the Rockets, and lastly, Robert Parrish for Boston Celtics.
So my list was a little different. So I had Dr. J, Bernard King, Charles Barkley, Hakeem Olajuwon, and then Jack Sikma.
Yeah, I
Um,
think I think with Parrish and Sigma, they both had similar talents and abilities. I just give Parrish the nod because of his championships during the decade, and he was a significant contributor on each of those Celtics title teams. But I think Sigma is a good pick. And who's your other? score. Bernard King, definitely a good scorer. I think that with King, there are about 3 or 4 players you could slot in with him, like George Gervin, Bernard King, Sidney Moncrief, Adrian Dantley, Alex English, and Joe Dumars. They're all similar players in the sense that they all scored a lot of points, but they weren't the greatest of defenders. So I think that with those guys, you could really slot any of them in for each other in that position.
Yeah, like Bernard King, he's definitely a guy that when you talk to older people who have been around and watched basketball a lot, they always give respect to Bernard King. I've seen some people go as far to say he was the Kevin Durant of that era. I personally can't comment on a good amount of these players just because I wasn't around, but based off what I've seen with my own eyes, like through highlights and all that and stats, yeah, he definitely is one of those players that you could definitely slot in there.
Yeah, and just some other honorable mentions I have written down for you. Like you said, Jack Sikma, the guys we mentioned previous. So Adrian Dantley, Joe Dumars, and also Dennis Johnson of the Boston Celtics. Just a really good contributor again on a title team. Always gave good scoring and two-way presence. So I think he deserves at least a mention for our all-decade teams.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, with our brief overview of the 80s out of the way, we're both going to talk about one player who we think is maybe in some ways the best or the most influential player from the decade. And we both have two sides of the same coin. And your side is the Boston Celtic legend Larry Bird, correct?
Yes.
And I know you have a few stories you wanted to share. So, what is your craziest Larry Bird story for us?
So there's a couple of stories, but before I give them, I'm just going to give a brief analysis on Larry Bird's game for those of you who don't necessarily know what he's all about. So he was one of the best scorers in the game. He averaged 24, 10, and 6 throughout his entire career. He has accolades that are compared to some of the all-time greats. He's a 3-time champ, 2 times Finals MVP, 3-time regular season MVP, and he's also the last person to win 3 MVPs in a row, 12-time All-Star and 10-time All-NBA, as well as a 3-time All-Defensive player. Like he can play all sides of the court. He's a great playmaker, and he's also was also a very efficient scorer, being in the 50, 40, 90 club twice.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, if you're going to talk about modern day comparisons, there's really no one you can necessarily say just
Yeah.
because how special he is. But if you were to say, like, give a bunch of modern day players, you could probably say, like, a bit of Dirk when it comes to his post fades and his post game. You could talk about LeBron and Jokic when it comes to his passing and
Yeah.
playmaking. Obviously, Jokic, because one of Larry Bird's signatures was the overhead pass where he wouldn't even look at where he was passing and it would find the guy.
Yeah.
Um, and then also I mentioned Luka Doncic, not necessarily like his game, but just like the feel they have with the ball. Like they're tall players that can bring the ball up the court and facilitate an offense.
Yeah. With Bird, he has a really unfortunate career because throughout his career, he was one of the best hustle guys while still being a megastar. Like every time a loose ball would go, he'd be diving on the floor. And if you look at clips from it, he really hurt himself a lot of the times because he would go diving into crowds. And that really cut his career short because he only played in the NBA for 13 years,
Yeah,
12 years. And a large part of that is because in '87 he hurt his back, and a large reason why he had that is because of his hustle. So it's really unfortunate, but in his short career, he was a tremendous player. I think one part of his game that really goes overlooked is his rebounding ability. I mean, for a guy who was playing with two really good big men in Robert Parrish and Kevin McHale, he still averaged 10 rebounds a game for his career. So having those three guys in the paint and at least securing rebounds, that really helps your team out on the defensive end because it limits second chances and allows for you to get more offensive possessions.
yeah, for sure. And also like you said, having those big men, and then obviously that one year or those couple years when they had Bill Walton as well.
Yeah. I think that Bird is one of those players where like we've said in previous podcasts, it's hard to say whether or not a player would be better in today's NBA than they were in their day. I think he is one of those guys, though, because he's one of the best shooters of all time, but he only took, I don't know,
Well,
he made less than 1 3 a game for his
yeah,
career, correct? So
yeah,
if you put him in today's NBA with his confidence and his shooting ability, he'd be dominating from the 3 point line in similar fashions to guys like Kevin Durant. So I think if he played in today's NBA, he'd definitely be as good, if not better, than he was in his day. And I know some people, especially, point to his lack of athleticism as a deterrent. But I mean, look at guys like Nikola Jokic. I mean, he's a top 2 big man in the league, and he's never been that athletic. So I think while Bird's lack of athleticism may not have helped him on the defensive end, it wouldn't have made a difference for him on offense.
yeah. And another thing that you have to notice is if Larry Bird was born into this era, he'd have the influence of a 3 point line. He'd probably start shooting threes at a lot younger of an age because his first year was the year where the 3 point line was introduced. So it's not like players like that were practicing threes um, when they're like 5 years old, like a bunch of kids are right now. And
Yeah.
I'm sure there would be a lot of parts in his game that would be improved just from being in an era now. But when you look at like his work ethic and just his like competitive nature, which I'll talk about right now, it's really interesting to see how that would turn out.
Yeah.
Speaking of his competitive nature, I have 3 stories about Larry Bird that are just crazy when you hear about it. These types of stories you don't see today. Um, so the first story I have is about his baseball career in college. So, as many of you might know, Larry Bird played for Indiana State University, and he was a star player, one of the best players in college. And he had a rivalry with Magic Johnson, who we're going to be talking about later as well. So the year that Bird went 33-1, and that one loss is to Magic Johnson's Michigan team. Larry was icing himself, and the ISU baseball coach kept on seeing him ice himself. So he knew that Bird had thick skin and that he was a trash talker. So he went over to Bird to give him a hard time, and basically told Bird that real men play sports with balls this size, and he made a shape of a baseball in his hands. And then he said anybody can play games with balls this size. He made a shape of a basketball. So he was basically betting Larry Bird to suit up for the baseball team um, and just see what he can do. So Larry Bird obviously was up for the challenge. First at bat in a D1 baseball game, he strikes out miserably, but he still gets a standing ovation just because he's Larry Bird. And the guy that he healthy scratched was actually really mad at Larry because the guy that was a healthy scratch got struck out all the time. He was one of the worst players on the team. And he was thinking to himself, no one gives me a standing ovation for being struck out, obviously because he's not Larry Bird. But his next at bat, he goes, hits a 2 RBI single, and ends his baseball career batting 500, which
Just
is
walked out after that.
pardon?
You just quit on the spot.
Yeah, he quit after that. He quit right away.
That's how you leave like a boss. I mean, just get your RBI. I believe I saw something where this is still a record at that university to this day, right?
Yeah, yeah. Still to this day,
Yeah.
batting 500,
Yeah,
which
Bird was a guy, and this is a repeated theme in his career, where if you challenge him to do something, he will go and do it, and he'll make you look like a fool for doing it.
yeah. And speaking of challenges, Bird would put challenges on himself. For example, the time where he played 3 quarters of a basketball game only with his left hand. So
Yeah,
it was against Portland. He basically told all the media that then this game he was just going to play with his left hand through at least 3 quarters. And through 3 quarters, Bird scored 27 points. And then he
yeah,
finished the game with 47 points. It was actually a 47-point triple double on 60% shooting.
yeah,
And to make things even better, he hit the game tying shot to send the game into overtime. And then he proceeded to hit the game-winning shot in overtime.
Yeah. Was he shooting left-handed because he was injured, or did he just get bored kind of thing? And is that why he did it?
I think it was a getting bored kind of thing because in the fourth quarter he switched back to his right hand, and
Yeah.
this was after a successful road trip. So I
Yeah.
guess he was just trying to spice things up. But it's just crazy. Like, not only did he was he successful
Yeah.
during that game with his left, averaging 27. He had a 47-point triple double.
Yeah, I think that there are very few players in NBA history who could try that and actually do it. I think Kobe Bryant is probably the other one who could get away with it, but you never see a guy switch hands like that in today's NBA, even though guys who aren't the greatest of shooters are encouraged to. So maybe if a guy like Ben Simmons switch shooting hands, maybe he'll get a 47-point triple double one day. You never know.
Yeah, exactly. And then the final thing story, it's just like a testament to like how great he is and how good he is at basketball. It was against the Supersonics, and he told the guy who was guarding him, which was Xavier McDaniel, exactly what he was going to do. He told him that I'm going to get the ball right here, and I'm going to shoot it in your face. And then McDaniel said, "I know, I'll be waiting." So after the timeout, Bird comes, does his little move to get into that spot, turns around, shoots it in McDaniel's eye, and scores, right?
Yeah.
And to add insult to injury, he told him that he accidentally left 2 seconds on the clock.
I think Bird's irrational confidence is it's really what made him special because it just the brashness on the court was really unheard of at that point where a guy we'll talk about in a minute, Magic Johnson, he was the opposite. He was quiet, he was humble, smiling all the time. Whereas Bird, one story I have is in one of the, I want to say 86 3 point contest, before the 3 point contest starts, he walks into the change room and says, "Who's coming in second place tonight?" And then he proceeds to go and win the contest. So I think that irrational confidence that Bird had in his own abilities, that really made him special and especially unique as a player in the era where a lot of the top stars were friendly, likable guys.
Yeah, and also, like Bird's game was just like, although he wasn't athletic, it was just like electrifying to watch. Um,
Yeah,
and one game in particular, which even got the attention of the other team, was when he scored 60 against Atlanta. Like he was just unconscious. Like there was one time where he hit a and 1 3 that didn't count, but when he hit that, you could see the Hawks bench just go insane. And it was
yeah,
just for that play. Like there was one play where the guy was up on Larry Bird's chest. He had no move, like no room to shoot, and he was able to shoot the ball over him and make like the post fade.
yeah.
And the
It,
bench just went ballistic.
it's one of the best game performances to watch because the bench, the Celtics bench, if you watch, they're not like as excited as the opposing teams is, and it's just insane to see how how dominant he was and how that was able to translate with where even the opposing team who was getting their butt kicked by him at that moment, even they are kind of like, how is he doing this? You know?
Yeah. And one thing that I liked, I was watching the highlights the other day, and I just like the sense of camaraderie that the players had at the time. Like the coach would intentionally leave Bird in so he could beat McHale's record because like a couple weeks before that game, Kevin McHale got the Celtics record for most points in a game. And then Bird beat it a couple weeks later, and just seeing like the whole team, like McHale was passing the ball to Bird so Bird could beat it. Like
Yeah.
I don't know if you'd see that in this game. Like I don't know if Alex Caruso was about to beat LeBron's scoring record. I don't know if LeBron would pass it to him.
I think that's still around on some teams this year. Like when Klay Thompson beat Steph Curry's 3 point record a few years ago against my Chicago Bulls. But in that game, Steph Curry was cheering him on. He was getting him looks. I think that there aren't too many teams like that in today's NBA. But at the same time, I think there are a few. Like Steph Curry, especially, is one of those guys where if his own teammates beat his record, I don't think he minds too much.
Yeah.
But
And
but guys like Bird and McHale, like that bond they had on the court, it really translated to their success to
mhm.
where their flow for one another and their like combined talents and how they could play well together. That just really helped them win for the better part of the decade.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. Like you mentioned Steph and Clay, like those are probably the two biggest class acts in the NBA. Like just like the way they carry themselves and also their success
Yeah,
in the league, like winning multiple championships.
yeah. Both are great pairings, and I think Bird and McHale definitely rank like they're an underrated all-time duo. But at the same time, if you look at them, they won 3 championships together. They made a few more and lost in the finals. And for the better part of the 1980s, they led to the Celtics to some pretty great teams and pretty great records all throughout the decade.
Yeah, and I mean like the individual teams as well. They're kind of underrated. No one really talks about them as like well, obviously people talk about them as like these all-time great dynasties, but when
Yeah,
you look at like some of the individual players, Dennis Johnson, who is a Hall of Famer, multiple-time All-Star, um, multiple-time champion, Danny Ainge, great shooter, kind of like another player that would not necessarily fit right in just because of the low amount of threes that players like him took, but like
yeah,
another player that was really solid at the time, one of the greater GMs in the league right now as well.
yeah,
Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and then at one point Bill Walton and Robert Parrish. Like those are guys like 3 7-footers that can all play
yeah.
on one team.
Yeah, definitely one of the better, most talented teams. I think that '86 team, especially where they sweep the Rockets in the finals, and you have Bird winning MVP, and you have what's Bill Walton winning Sixth Man of the Year. That team especially is probably a top 5 team of all time, right alongside like the Warriors and the Bulls, because that team they killed in the playoffs, killed in the regular season, and they had a really good combination of talent that year, and they're just one of the better teams of all time. Just
I mean,
plain
that team had 5 Hall of Famers, and then 4 of them were playing at All Star level. So
precisely. Anyways, while we are talking about Bird, you cannot talk about the career of Larry Bird without mentioning his chief rival, Irving Magic Johnson, and that's who I'll be talking about for influence. Now, just a few quick things on Magic Johnson. I'll start with his career resume. 12-time All-Star, 3 times MVP. He was top 5 in MVP voting 9 times, 9 straight years from 1983 to 1991. He's a 5-time champion and 4 times finals runner up, 3 times final MVP, 4-time assist leader, 2 times steal leader, the second best player on the infamous Dream Team, and he's a career 20-7. Now, Magic Johnson, for those who don't know, he is arguably, in my opinion, easily the best point guard of all time. He redefined what skills were possible for a player who was tall, and he's also arguably the first true positionless player in the NBA. At 6'9", Magic Johnson, up until 2017, was the tallest point guard of all time, and yet he was able to control the ball and be this amazing playmaker despite his height. And at that time, a lot of guys who were 6'9" were just kind of low post guys or big men who stood in the paint. Meanwhile, Magic Johnson was out getting a rebound, pushing the pace, doing some crazy pass on fast break, and running an offense at historic levels. So his height and ability to run an offense and be this amazing playmaker, it really changed the game for what you could do as a guard. And we see it in later generations where guys like Penny Hardaway, LeBron James, and Ben Simmons now, it doesn't matter that they're 6'8", 6'9", because of the layout and template set by Magic Johnson, they kind of took the route where they could be these great playmakers and ball handling despite their height. Whereas before, guys their height would have just been wing players, 3-and-D kind of guys, or low post guys. Would you agree with that?
yeah, definitely, like, especially in today's league where versatility is so important. Um,
Yeah,
especially at the power forward and center position, and also at the guards. Like you see Ben Simmons and LeBron and
yeah,
Luka playing point guard, and they're all north of 6'7".
yeah. And with Magic, his positionless, it wasn't just kind of theoretically he could play at any position. In his rookie year in the NBA Finals, after teammate Kareem Abdul-Jabbar got hurt, he filled in at center, scored 42 points, got 15 rebounds and 8 assists, and he won Finals MVP. So he truly could play any position, and he proved that at all times. And having a guy like that, that's kind of it really set the template for today's NBA, where these positionless players who can guard multiple positions, run an offense, and still be able to play in any system in any role. Like that's really important in today's NBA, and that kind of had its roots with Magic Johnson. Some other things on his playmaking. He's the greatest playmaker ever. He has the highest assists per game in NBA history for any player, ahead of guys like John Stockton, Steve Nash, and Jason Kidd. I would say that he extended Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's prime by about 5 years. Before Magic came, Kareem couldn't make it out of the first round, was starting to decline a bit. But then when Magic came back, Kareem really had a revitalization because of Magic's ability to make his teammates better, where he could balance having guys like Byron Scott, James Worthy, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and still make sure that their offense was evenly distributed amongst those players. And the other thing to note about Magic is his ability, his creativity with the ball, and his flash and finesse with the ball, and these crazy passes he can make. It really inspired a lot of future generations where crazy ball handling abilities and flashy passes really weren't too common before Magic. And he really changed that, where after him, you see guys like Jason Williams and Allen Iverson with their crossover and handles and playmaking ability. Magic Johnson was really the first NBA player to do that. So I think he was really the stepping stone of all point guards to come after him. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, like you had guys before, like Bob Cousy and like Pistol Pete, like who did that, but Magic Johnson definitely was the one that kind of made it popular.
Yeah. And I think that with him, like, if he had played more years, unfortunately, again, like Bird, his career was cut short due to his diagnosis of HIV. But if he had played a few more years, he would have easily been the all-time assist leader in the NBA. And with the weak competition in the West in the '90s, which we'll talk about on our next episode, he may have been able to make the finals another 2 times. And the other thing about him is, while his playmaking abilities were great, he could still score the ball at a high level. I mean, he's a career 20 points per game. In the finals, he's had series where he's averaged 26 plus points. So his ability to be simultaneously a great playmaker and a great scorer, it really set the basis for future point guards to come.
Yeah, I mean, like when you talk about Magic, like the LeBron comparison comes out a lot. Like obviously, a lot of people say LeBron's better, but when like you're looking at their two careers, like they're pretty similar. A bunch
Yeah,
of people now say like LeBron is a facilitator first, but when you
yeah,
look at, like a true facilitator first, that's Magic Johnson's
yep,
career. Um, Obviously, all-time assists like in points per game. And even the one season he came back, he still averaged like 14 points per game and a couple assists. And this was when he was a 36-year-old.
yeah,
So who knows what happened if he never got HIV? Like you said, he might have made the finals a couple more times. His like career stats would definitely be a lot higher. Um,
yeah,
and that's kind of another theme for players like in the 80s. Larry and Magic, their careers were kind of cut short. And Jordan, like even though he's a 90s player, all for different reasons. Larry and Magic, though, mostly like due to injury.
yeah. Speaking of careers cut short, do you want to briefly move on to our underrated players section? So for me, he's not my main choice for underrated in this era, but I think one of the guys who was a really talented player and who had a really short career due to things that were not his fault is Ralph Sampson of the Houston Rockets. So just for those casual viewers, because he's not a mainstay name, in 1986, the Houston Rockets beat the LA Lakers in 5 games in the conference finals and advanced to the NBA finals, where their two best players were Hakeem Olajuwon and this other center named Ralph Sampson. Now, Sampson was a really mobile, fast player at 7'4", so he was a giant, and this really led him to be able to score a lot and be a great defender. his 3-year peak in the mid 80s was around 21 points, 11 rebounds, 3 assists, a steal, and 2 blocks. With him alongside Hakeem Olajuwon, the Rockets had one of the best two big men combinations of all time, alongside guys like Tim Duncan and David Robinson, where you really couldn't score on two players who were north of 7 feet each, grab a board and score from the post. And in '86, Ralph Sampson was a pretty young player. Hakeem Olajuwon was in his second season in the league. And so a lot of people thought going forward, they would be this perennial contender. They'd be able to beat the Lakers in a few years, and they'd probably have a few rings together. And this is where the what if happens, where after they make the finals, that Houston Rockets team explodes, where they have players who don't play because of salary issues. They have guys who leave the team and get suspended by the NBA because of drug use. And with Ralph Sampson, his knees at 7'4", they just gave out. So he has this injury-riddled career, and he never regains that success he had in his earlier years. But it's a really good what if, because when he was playing and when he was young, he was this really talented player, and him and Hakeem were this dominant front court. But unfortunately, due to injuries, he just got left behind in the NBA.
My underrated pick for the 80s is Alex English. And the reason why is he was one of the players that was kind of like he would work in his era. He was a product of like the climate in his era. Um, and that's probably one of the main reasons why he isn't talked about today. He was a
Yeah,
great mid-range shooter, but other than that, he wasn't really the most athletic.
yeah,
Um, he never had like these crazy dunks or these crazy layups. He was a very fundamentally sound player with a great mid-range jumper.
yeah,
And he also played on a team that was offensive minded and didn't really have the best defense. In
yeah,
fact, they were one of the worst defensive teams in the entire league for multiple years.
yeah.
Um,
Would you say he was of the DeMar DeRozan mold?
yeah, I maybe like a less athletic DeRozan type player, but a more efficient shooter.
Yeah,
Um, he averaged about 26 points per game, 6 rebounds and 4 assists during the 80s,
yeah,
and he made 8 All-Star appearances and 3 All-NBAs. And what's interesting about him is he was a late bloomer, and he made his first All-Star appearance in his 6th year. Um, he had a great like I said, great mid-range jumper and a high release, and that's part of the reason why he was so unstoppable and
yeah,
racked up so much points. It was this weird, awkward high release that no one could contest, kind of like Kevin Durant. But the only difference between Kevin Durant and Alex English is Kevin Durant's like 6'10", 6'11". Alex
yeah,
English was 6'7". Um, and like it was just awkward. Like if you watch his game, it was just very fundamentally sound, very boring to watch.
yeah,
Um, and like you said, like almost a DeMar DeRozan type player. And his team had some really good scorers like Kiki Vandeweghe and Dan Issel, and they were like all terrible on defense. In
yeah.
fact, one of their games finished in a triple overtime loss to the Detroit Pistons, and you won't believe this score: 186 to 184. Like that's
Jeez.
insane. I didn't even know that
Yeah,
coming into it. Um, and then other than that, like his career, it's kind of forgettable.
yeah,
He made it to 2 conference finals,
yeah,
um, and he lost to some of the all-time great teams. Like he lost to the Lakers. Um, it's kind of hard to justify like or say that like he wasn't good because he's a Hall of Famer, obviously, and he was just kind of in that era where the Showtime Lakers were just so dominant,
yeah.
um, and his team was also terrible on defense.
Yeah, I think that the '80s, especially, they have a bunch of players, as we said before, in the Alex English role, like Bernard King, Adrian Dantley, later on Joe Dumars for a bit, Dale Ellis, where they have these tremendous scores, but they all do it on teams that are terrible defensively and they don't have any playoff success. And because of that, a lot of them don't get remembered. And the other thing is the 80s were defined by the Magic Bird rivalry and the NBA's ability to promote that rivalry and its ability to become a household kind of fixation. But the worst part about it is in the 80s, the teams that were making the finals were the Lakers 8 times, the Celtics, I want to say 5 or 6, the Sixers once, the Rockets twice, and the Pistons 3 times towards the end. So because of the lack of overall diversity, a lot of these guys especially get forgotten because they never had playoff success because of the dominance of these upper teams.
Yeah. And I mean, also when it comes to like individual regular season awards, like you have Bird, who's a 3-time MVP, Magic, another 3-time MVP. Um, you have Moses Malone, who won one year. Like that's like 7 out of the 10 MVPs in that decade. So a bunch of the guys like you just mentioned, although they were great scorers, um, and a bunch of them racked up scoring champs before Michael Jordan came. Um, like they kind of have forgettable careers just because they weren't able to make it past the finals, like you said.
Yeah. Speaking of Moses Malone, I think Moses is the most underrated NBA player for sure of the 80s and possibly of all time. And I think that it has a lot to do with the fact that his peak was between 1977 and 1983. So you can't really define him as an 80s player or a 70s player despite his dominance. But at the same time, I mean, if you look at his career accolades, 1 time champ, 1 time finals runner up, finals MVP in his championship season, 3 time MVP, 12 time All Star, had the rebounding title 6 times, and was 20 and 12 for his career. Those are one of the better numbers for any center, like on par with guys like David Robinson and Patrick Ewing. And he was one of the best rebounders of all time. His offensive rebounding, especially, is outstanding. He is the career leader in NBA and ABA history for offensive rebounds with 7,300. Would you like to guess where the next player, like how much the next player has on that list?
Probably like I don't know 5,000.
4,800. So Moses Malone holds the offensive rebounding record by 2,500 offensive boards. That it's just insane to think of how he had this like Dennis Rodman-esque ability to just track down offensive rebounds at an astounding rate, and he had the strength and capabilities to maneuver his way into getting them. A lot of people, like a lot of the sources I've read on Moses Malone, say, and pardon me for saying this, that his butt was literally so big that he was able to maneuver players out of the way to get offensive rebounds and then just go up at will and have little players stop him. His physicality was amazing. I mean, his ability to score, he wasn't the most dominant post player or a jump shooter, but at the same time, his big body could just bulldoze through anyone. Like he beat Kareem in the 81 playoffs, absolutely dominated him. And then in 83, he did it again where they beat the Lakers in the finals. So his ability to back down even guys, pretty solid defenders like Kareem, that really makes him stand out. And at the same time, I mean, again, another reason why he's underrated is because he had an awkward personality. Like in the media, he wasn't like a guy like Magic Johnson or Larry Bird, where he was open with the media and he had this personality where you could easily make storylines to him and easily promote him. He's more of a shy guy who kind of just stuck to the background. But at the same time, he is one of the most dominant centers of all time, but he really doesn't get talked so as much. So I think he really is one of the better centers of all time, but he just doesn't get that respect at times.
Yeah, I think another reason why is kind of because his prime was like in the 70s and 80s, like kind of like in between both eras.
Yeah.
Obviously, when he was playing for the Houston Rockets, he was ridiculously good. He also was one of those players that didn't even go to college. One of the first players that made it to the NBA in another way. He started off playing in the ABA when he was 18 years old, and
Yeah.
really one of the first players to get to the league like that. And that's just
Yeah.
like a testament to how good he was, that he was able to play professionally before
Yeah.
college.
Yeah. He's definitely a guy where another big part of why he's underrated is while he was dominant, Kareem was in the league and was in his prime during Moses's. So I think because of that, when you think of guys like centers from the 70s and 80s, goes right away to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, while Moses is more of an afterthought. But at the same time, he did have a really good career where he was able to win a title and he was able to win these MVP awards. And despite the competition from guys like Kareem.
Yeah, and one thing I have to touch on, like just that Sixers team, like Moses, like every time I see pictures of him, he looks like that guy like you don't want to drive in the same paint he is. And
Yeah,
then put on top of that, Daryl Dawkins was on that Sixers team too, probably one of the most athletic big men of all time. Like
yeah,
imagine going into the paint with those guys because especially Moses Malone, like near the end of his career, like with the Sixers, like
yeah,
before he went to the Hawks and all that, like he kind of looked like that guy that just wanted to scrap. Like
yeah.
you go in, like you're getting socked in the face.
I think while this team, Moses and Dr. J, were out of their primes, the 85 Sixers, which had them and Charles Barkley, was one of the most like fascinating, unsuccessful teams ever, where you have Moses and Charles Barkley. Like Charles Barkley is like a suited up Daryl Dawkins. So just having those two in the paint, I think if they were in their primes, that would have been an astounding thing to watch. Where just these big bodies who can bulldoze anyone in their way and just get to the rim at will. So, anyways, back on the 80s, we got a little sidetrack there. Back on the topic of the 80s, is there any other player or thing you want to bring up while we're here?
No, not really. I mean, I think Isaiah Thomas, he's one player that is like great. That not necessarily underrated, but people don't really give him the credit that he deserves.
Yeah, I think he, especially, I think we got to go over the ESPN top 74 players list because he gets so disrespected on that. Up until Steph Curry, and up until Steph Curry very recently, Isaiah was largely considered the second best point guard of all time, right behind Magic, because he was a smaller Magic where he was an amazing passer, could move the ball to all his players, but at the same time was a really good scorer. And I think he just gets forgotten a lot because he was in the shadow of Magic and he wasn't in an era with guys like Nash or Kidd where they each had turns as the best point guard. So I think that he is probably now he's behind Steph Curry, but at the same time, he was a dominant player. He won 2 titles and he made it to the finals another time. So I think his success and his dominance on the court gets a little forgotten about in terms of just how good he was.
Yeah, and he was also incredibly fast too. Like, when I watch the Bad Boy Pistons highlights, um, I mean it's a little hard to watch 80's highlights because you know the television screen back then wasn't all that good. But and it like I got confused between Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars because like Joe Dumars is like number 4 and IT is number 14. But anyway, like just the pace, like how he's able to make those transition passes look so effortless because like it's kind of hard to not necessarily make a transition pass to a wide open guy, but like to time it where that guy's in the best possible spot
Yeah,
to score. Like I mean, like only elite playmakers have that ability, like Nash, Magic, Isaiah Thomas, Stockton. There's not too many guys who make it look that effortless.
yeah. He's probably, especially with him, like when you think of a lot of the great point guards outside of Magic, they all had not the longest amount of primes. Like Nash had a really good stretch of about 7 or 8 years. Jason Kidd had about 8 or 9 years. Isaiah was legitimately a superstar for about 12. And I
Hmm.
think his consistency in terms of just how he was really good year in and year out, that really helps his placement as one of the best point guards of all time.
Yeah, and I mean, like on that ESPN list, I know you had a problem with Stockton and Nash being ahead of him.
Definitely Stockton. I think Isaiah's better than Nash just because Nash
As a
is
scorer.
what wasn't as good of a defender and scorer. But I think John Stockton didn't have the success, didn't have the scoring ability, was probably a better point like playmaker but not by much. Like we're talking margins here. And the other thing is Stockton steals. He wasn't like a if you have John Stockton guarding you, you are getting locked up. He was never like that. So in that aspect, Isaiah's just talent overall was a lot better than his, and I think that having Stockton rated ahead wasn't fair at all to Isaiah.
Yeah, and I mean, like these lists, they love to talk about rings and stuff like that, and those two guys are both point guards that don't have rings.
Yeah,
And Isaiah has like what, two,
too.
three?
Yep. Yep.
He has a good amount, so um, definitely one player that kind of gets overlooked, especially like through the whole Last Dance thing. Like he was kind of roasted just because his relationship with Michael and a bunch of other players in the league, like they don't really take him seriously, but
Yeah.
it is
Um,
what it is.
yeah. The rings, especially, like he was able to win 2 titles as the best player on his team, whereas Stockton came up short twice in terms of his performance as well as team performance. And Nash didn't really even get the chance. Well, he did have the chances, but for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about eventually, was never able to crack that surface level and win a title. So I think Isaiah should definitely be ahead of those two in terms of success. And the other thing with Isaiah is I find that sometimes when we're grading all-time greats, like especially I've done this at times with Phil Jackson recently, you shouldn't judge just how great of a person or player was because of their later management career, where with Isaiah Thomas, he was a disaster as the GM of the New York Knicks,
And the
and Phil
Raptors.
Jackson was too. But at the same time, you can't hold that against him for his talent as a player.
Yeah,
So,
100%.
anyways, so I think we are done for today, and that concludes our podcast on the 1980s era of basketball, which we can sum up as a lot of scoring, more television deals, and more popularity, and the greatest rivalry of all time as well. On our next podcast, we will be talking only naturally, of course, about the 1990s. And once again, we'll talk about some brief things from the era, the best player specifically from this era, and a few guys that we think are underrated, and a few other things we want to throw in. So, from Max and Julian, we wish you all a good night.
See ya.